Welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John Kirkwood, and this is...
Payton.
What does a commentary from the late journalist Harry Reasoner and Baby Yoda, what can a commentary by Harry Reasoner and the phenomenon of Baby Yoda teach us about the Incarnation? This and more on Church Without Walls. I can't hear anyone, so I think we're working. Anyway, we're going anyway. I'm sure I'll get a text from somebody if things aren't working right. So, Cal Thomas recently shared a column where he relates a commentary from Harry Reasoner from 1973, a very turbulent time in America, Watergate, post-Vietnam, just come out of all the assassinations of the previous decade and all the deaths from Janis Joplin to Jimi Hendrix and the breakup of bands and so forth. And so it was a real turbulent race riots, the craziness of 68. Harry Reasoner, well-known journalist, writes a commentary at Christmas about the Incarnation. And I want to share a little bit from his commentary with you just as a foundation for us to talk about the Incarnation and how we can be distracted when it comes to really this amazing story of God becoming man, right? Harry writes, Christmas is such a unique idea that most non-Christians accept it, and I think sometimes envy it. If Christmas is the anniversary of the appearance of the Lord of the universe in the form of a helpless baby, it's quite a day. It's a startling idea, and the theologians who sometimes love logic more than they love God find it uncomfortable. But if God did do it, he had a tremendous insight. I want to stop there and just pick apart that piece a little bit here, because Harry Reasoner's not a theologian. He doesn't teach in seminaries. He's not a pastor. When you bring up his name, you think newsman. You don't think Christian right away. You don't think of that, quite frankly, that he's got any connection to the faith. And yet he has this insight here where he says, if Christmas is the anniversary of the appearance of the Lord of the universe in the form of a helpless baby, it's quite a day. It's a startling idea, and the theologians, who sometimes love logic more than they love God, find it uncomfortable. And the theologians, who sometimes love logic more than they love God, find it uncomfortable. That's a brilliant insight. It's something that both George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis saw was a problem with theologians. It's something that the Apostle Paul saw was a problem with theologians. It's something that Jesus warned against and often rebuked were the theologians. And I'm not picking on all theologians because I've learned a great deal from them, but there's this tendency, right, to miss the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest, however you want to look at it. But in this case, Harry's saying they're a little bit embarrassed about this story about God becoming man, being born in a stable or in a trough, if you would, and they don't like to defend virgin birth, and they kind of shy away from it. But then you have the apologists who love that stuff, and Christmas is reduced to their evidence that they're going to trot out to prove to you that the Gospels aren't stories of the Incarnation, but they're news headlines like from the New York Times, that they're accurate like police reports, and there are no contradictions and so forth. And now you run into a bunch of problems when you present the story in that manner as a news story or as some kind of historical kind of insight. And more than, for example, just eyewitness testimony, because it's not. There are contradictions, and you run into a bit of a problem with that. And I'm thinking of a recent Unbelievable broadcast where the theologian Lydia McGrew was on debating a New Testament scholar who specializes in the Incarnation and the stories behind it. And she just twisted herself into a pretzel trying to defend the Gospels as accurate history and containing no errors or contradictions or differences or distinctions. And it was embarrassing. Quite frankly, it was frightful. Because if you are not a Christian and you're listening to this, you know that one of the two people on the show is full of it. And Lydia McGrew admitted, she said, I try and harmonize this story like a policeman tries to harmonize eyewitness testimony of a car accident. Well, a policeman, if you know anything about police work, a policeman doesn't harmonize eyewitness testimony because some of it's wrong. Right? We know that some of it's wrong. He doesn't harmonize testimony or he'd never solve crimes. He has to sift it. He has to sift through that evidence and find out what happened, because if somebody said it was a brown car that was involved in the hit and run and somebody else said it was a white van, you don't harmonize that to a tan SUV. You just don't. And so we find apologists at this time of the year responding. Christians are oftentimes too much in a reaction mode. So Time Magazine or Newsweek or somebody else who's got an agenda comes out with a story saying, that there's nothing to this story, right? It's just myth that Christians trot out. And there, was there a real Jesus? All that kind of stuff that comes out every year because Satan's got the same playbook, and it's tired and it's foolish. And yet, like the dog, right, or like the cat responding to that little laser light on the floor and chasing it around, foolish Christian apologists who think their job is to connect every dot and to dot every I, or I should say dot every T and cross every I, rush out, to the sound of the fire to defend, this poor baby Jesus and show the perfect evidence to prove it. And we lose the magic. We lose the mystery. We lose the point of what the gospel writers are trying to do. And so somebody like this, this New Testament scholar who's trying to show that it's a lot less than what Lydia McGrew thinks, points out that there's some serious discrepancies and not just the not just the stories, how the two stories differ, but in some of the historical events that we know, like some of the dates that are involved in Luke and Matthew and that differ, and whether the wise men were there with the shepherds, and was it Bethlehem or Nazareth, and what about the census that was taken, and when does that show up, and the death of Herod, and all these things come into play. But the thing that really hurts is when he turns to her and he says, well, Paul was the first person who wrote Christian New Testament scripture, right? And Paul doesn't even mention the Incarnation. Uh-oh. Gets quiet in the room, right? And then you have the fact that only Matthew and Luke mention it. And, John and Mark don't. So you get to this place where you find out that whole denominations and whole branches of the Christian religion have made believing in the virgin birth and this kind of story, all the details that are in Matthew and Luke, part of the gospel, that you can't really be a Christian unless you believe in the virgin birth. And you have to rewrite the Acts of the Apostles when Paul is asked by the Philippian jailer, what must I do to be saved? You have to rewrite that to say you must believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and that he was born of a virgin, and that, and people add all this stuff to what the gospel is, and we get caught up in trying to defend real foolishness, like trying to make a historical census work with what we're told in Matthew and Luke. And then it changes dates, it changes all kinds of things, and Christians look like they're lying. But we've missed the point, because the gospel writers weren't writing a New York Times blow by blow historical narrative. They weren't Bob Woodward. They didn't come across that way in the first century. People in the first century didn't read it that way. They weren't bothered by whether there were two angels or one angel at the empty tomb. They're not going to be bothered by that. They're going to just skip right over that because it wasn't critical. And yet Christians get caught up in this distraction of trying to prove something that requires faith. And what's missing from it. And it's the same thing that happens with Genesis. The theology is masked or disappears the very moment that we start arguing about what the meaning of yom means, the meaning of day. And is the day 24 hours, or is it an epoch of geological time, and all this stuff? When science comes into Genesis, theology goes out, because they were in pre-scientific times, the writers of Genesis, and they weren't writing science, and they weren't writing history. They weren't. They were writing theology, and they were trying to make sense of their ancient Near Eastern world, and they were trying to set themselves apart from the Babylonian creation myth and the other creation myths of the day, the Egyptian and the other Syrian, Ugaritic. So here's the thing. So when we consider the incarnation, remember first, this is God telling man the story of redemption and how it begins, and that God comes in human flesh, and he comes this way. And Harry Reasoner is right to point out that it's a startling idea, and theologians who sometimes love logic more than they love God find it uncomfortable. C.S. Lewis once wrote that theologians, sometimes they care so much about proving God, they lose track of their relationship with him. In other words, they care more about proving God than God himself. That has become an idol. That is the very description of an idol. So can apologetics become idolatry? Can theology become idolatry? Yes, we saw it in the Lord's Day. Is it dangerous? Yes. Is it a distraction? Yes. Can the enemy use it to blind otherwise people who be curious? Does the story lose its magic? Yes. J.R.R. Tolkien was talking with C.S. Lewis before he was saved, and he said, this is the story that every man wants to believe is true. Now, let me ask you something. Is the Christian story delivered by American Christians a story that every man wants to believe is true? I don't think so. I think that's why the rise of the new atheists. I think Christianity in the West has been tampered with. And I think the enemy, Screwtape and Wormwood, have crept in, and we've gone off chasing things down rabbit holes, and we've gone into a reactive nature instead of an active one, where we're actually carrying the gospel forward and the truth forward, and it's a joyous story of victory. Who doesn't like that story? And that's where Baby Yoda comes in. I'm going to talk about Baby Yoda. I thought you'd do a Baby Yoda drawing today, too. And look at this. It looks really good.
This before the show, so I was going to do a second drawing.
You're going to do a second drawing. Well, that one looks done already. I mean, do I have to stop talking, or I don't know. But we might get a second drawing. But so this craze with The Mandalorian, Jon Favreau, the writer of The Mandalorian, he's a great writer, by the way. He's breathed new life into an old and tired franchise. Star Wars was dying with the latest movies, but now Favreau has breathed new life into it as a true fan, and he's telling the story of the Mandalorian, which is this bounty hunter who wanders on the Child. The Child is what has been colloquially known in popular culture as Baby Yoda. And so I'm sure you've all seen images of Baby Yoda. I know you can get stuffed Baby Yodas at, what's that place called?
Build-A-Bear, Dad.
Build-A-Bear.
But half the things they sell aren't bears. I have a Minion, I have Pumbaa from Lion King, I have a bunny.
So they're not specifically bears. They're stuffed animals, but they're called Build-A-Yoda.
Anything.
You can build a Yoda. Anyway, the magic of this, and people are in love with Baby Yoda in a different way than they are with the baby Jesus at this time. And why is it? It's the same story. Yeah, Favreau's telling the same story really with Baby Yoda. There's something about something that we know is going to come with great power and have great capacity as he grows, and later in great wisdom. We know what Yoda becomes, right? And yet we see a early version of at least his species as a very young child, and the child is innocent, and everyone who, well, at least non-evil people who come in contact with him want to play. The children want to play with him and so forth. So yesterday, Wendy and I was going to say Wendy and I, Peyton and I watched episode 4 of season 1 of The Mandalorian, and it's where Jon Favreau tips his hat to the Magnificent Seven. I'm not going to give any spoilers out there. I'm just telling you this. So if you're a fan of Magnificent Seven, watch episode 4, season 1, and you'll see it. You'll see a hat tip to it by Favreau as it's relived on a planet in a distant galaxy, far, far away, and a long time ago, or whatever. And so I turned to Peyton, who hasn't seen the Magnificent Seven, and I said, "Well, now we have to watch the Magnificent Seven." And she said, "What's the Magnificent Seven?" And it broke my heart that I've been such a bad father that she doesn't know what it is up to this point. And I said, well, it's a wonderful story of a bunch of gunslingers who are recruited or hired, to save a village from marauders, from raiders. And as I'm telling her this story, I realize that I'm telling it kind of wrong, because the Magnificent Seven isn't the original story. The Magnificent Seven is itself a hat tip to the Seven Samurai, which is probably a hat tip to some prehistoric story that was handed down through an oral tradition. But so the Magnificent Seven is an Americanized Western version of the Seven Samurai. So ultimately, episode 4, season 1 of The Mandalorian is a hat tip to the Seven Samurai. So what does that mean? But we love these stories. It's built into the human psyche somehow that we love these stories of the strong protecting the weak against the bullies, right? Which is basically the Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven and the Mandalorian and the shock trooper of episode 4, season 1 of The Mandalorian. We love these stories so much that we want them retold. And this isn't just true of that particular motif. This is true of, for example, Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, where there's this street tramp who's uncouth and she's brought up under untoward circumstances, but we're trying to show, the story is trying to tell that, every pauper could be a princess under the right conditions, right? And so you have My Fair Lady, which turns out to be, was a 1980s rom-com known as Pretty Woman, which is basically My Fair Lady, is basically Pygmalion. So why do human beings, why do Homo sapiens love to hear the same story told over and over? It's not just children who say, "Read it again, Dad," or "Let's watch Shrek for the 300,000th time." Or it might be Frozen, oh, God have mercy, on our souls.
Not very big Frozen fan.
Well, what do you like to watch over and over and over?
I like to watch Jumanji.
Jumanji.
It's a good adventure movie.
Jumanji, the Rock version, because the Rock. Stop. Oh, sorry. So anyway, where are we? So here we have Harry Reasoner bringing up that this is a fascinating story, that God doesn't land on Earth like the Terminator does, muscle bound with hand to the ground, or like Thor does with the lightning and thunderbolts and the hammer of the gods. God doesn't arrive like many of the ancient peoples thought he would arrive, with the sky splitting open and Mount Sinai arrival. He comes in this fashion as an innocent, vulnerable, poor child. I think as Christians, we really need to resolve to remember the magic that we're sharing with people, and the mystery that we're sharing with people, and the power of the story, and not get caught up in trying to defend things that we were never meant to defend. or to prove things as if it's a mathematical equation, that when we get to the end of our argument or when we share just the right video, the person we're sharing with is going to get down on their knees and confess their sins and ask for repentance and make Jesus Lord and Savior of their heart. And you've just ruined an opportunity by making it that. And this is something that Harry Reasoner saw when he says it's a startling idea, and the theologians who sometimes love logic more than they love God find it uncomfortable. But if God did do it, he had a tremendous insight. What was that insight? People are afraid of God and standing in his very bright light. But everyone has seen babies, and almost everyone likes them. So if God wanted to be loved as well as feared, he moved correctly here. And if he wanted to know people as well as rule them, he moved correctly, because a baby growing up learns all there is to know about people. This is something that the writers of Arthur knew, the King Arthur myths. When there's one myth I'm rather fond of where Arthur's already king and he feels distant from his people, so he dresses in rags and he walks among the people and he, hears what they think of his government, and he's in touch with them again because he's one of them. And he shares in not only their insight, but in their experience. And this is what the Incarnation is. This is, if you see, the closest Paul comes to it is in Philippians 2, where he talks about the 7 steps in which God humbled himself by coming down from heaven's throne and taking up his life as a slave. He doesn't mention a virgin birth, but it's there, right? The Incarnation is there. And we lose that magic when we're trying to defend dates of the census by Quirinius and who was ruling at this time, and what was the physical nature of the Bethlehem star. And you see all this crap that Christians trot out instead of the beauty and the magic of this story. The phenomenon that makes Baby Yoda interesting to thousands of people who never liked Star Wars before. The vulnerability that there is around this child as he's being protected, right, by this angel-like Mandalorian. We lose all that. People are afraid of God and standing in his very bright light. People are afraid of God and standing in his very bright light isn't just true of pagans. It's mostly true of a lot of Christians I know. They fear God, they fear hell. They've been delivered this picture of God that's come out of reformed and deformed circles, that God is just a God of justice, and he really can't wait to throw the mass of humanity into an eternal fire to his own personal glory, because they couldn't live up to a certain standard, or they wouldn't bow and confess. And so we get this warped image of who God is, and you get the pagan image of who God is, the one who's coming in lightning bolts and thunder, whose voice you can't hear and you want to hide from in the rocks. This apocalyptic God who's coming to judge with blood up to the bridle straps, and that's what people are afraid of. And a lot of Christians you meet live in fear. They live in abject fear of the God they believe in. And they'd call it the Christian God, even though I'd argue that it's not. It's the picture of the Christian God that's been delivered them. But people are afraid of God standing in his very bright light. But everyone has seen babies, and almost everyone likes them. Paul writes that Jesus is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. If you want to understand the nature of the Trinity, we're given Jesus as something tangible that we can witness, that we can see and hear, and forgive me, touch. Yes? And so Jesus is the vision of God, not some chapter and verse that some hell, fire, and brimstone preacher slams his fist on his pulpit and delivers from Leviticus or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or even, Revelation or Matthew or something like that. And if we wanted to know people as well as rule them, he moved correctly, because a baby growing up learns all there is to know about people. If God wanted to be intimately a part of man, he moved correctly, for the experience of birth and familyhood is our most intimate and precious experience. I love this portion because Reasoner realizes that when God calls himself a father to us, when he calls himself a bridegroom to a bride, he's given us again tangible witness to his benevolent nature and his loving nature and his forgiving nature and his willingness to forgive and treat us with grace. And so we know what a loving father does. We've seen it in the reception of the prodigal. We know what a loving husband does. We've seen it in the long suffering of Hosea. And so that's God, not the God of the theologians who's angry and can't wait to torment you for 1,000 lifetimes in a furnace, something that the enemies of God do in Scripture, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar or Nero, or in modern times ISIS. So he mentions this connection to birth and familyhood as our most intimate and precious experience, and this is how God is communicating his truth as a father or as a loving husband. There's a wonderful thing, I'm sure you've seen it, I'm sure others have shared it, called The Man and the Birds, that the great radio personality once shared in one of his segments, The Rest of the Story, right? Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey tells a story about the man and the birds, and it was about a frustrated Christmas and Easter Christian who didn't want to go this year with his family to the midnight mass or whatever, the Christmas service. And so he stays home. There's a winter storm, and he looks outside his kitchen window, and he sees these birds that are just in misery because the storm came out of nowhere, and they weren't ready for it, and they're trapped in this storm. And it's a blizzard, and it's freezing, and it's snowing, and it's like, and these birds are so uncomfortable, and he goes out there and he tries to shoo them into the warmth and the security of the family barn, and the birds don't understand, and they think he's just an added menace to the storm, right, and not somebody who's coming to rescue them or save them. And he thinks, just at the moment, he thinks, if only I could communicate to them in a language they could understand, they would come into the security of the barn and they'd accept its warmth and really the saving nature of the barn in the midst of this deadly storm. And just as he has this thought, if only I was a bird and they could follow me, he hears the pealing of the church bells on Christmas night, and he realizes that this is the story of the Incarnation. This is the story of God become man, because we can't listen to God and his voice, and we're scared of that voice on Mount Sinai. We have to take God in a capacity that doesn't curl us into a fetal position and having us cover our ears and our eyes. And God realizes that. And this is the story that Reasoner is sharing here. And Reasoner had more insight in this one little commentary than most theologians do, or certainly most modern apologists do, who are trying to convince the skeptic by throwing reason and logic at him, hoping that something sticks. So it comes beyond logic, writes Reasoner. It's what a bishop I used to know called a kind of divine insanity. It is either all falsehood or it is the truest thing in the world. It is the story of the great innocence of God, the baby. God in the power of man. And it is such a dramatic shot toward the heart that if it is not true for Christians, nothing is true. So even if and he finishes with this, so even if you did not get your shopping all done and you are swamped with the commercialism and frenzy, be at peace. And even if you are a deacon having to arrange, bless you, Bella, and even if you are a deacon having to arrange the extra seating for all the Christmas Christians that you won't see until Easter, be at peace. The story stands. It's all right that so many Christians are touched only once a year by this incomparable story, because some final, quiet Christmas morning, the touch will take. Christmas has a power over those who observe it and those who do not that is unlike any other holiday or event. The other 364 days of the year, we can be caught up in affairs of world-shaking significance. But on Christmas, it is as if all systems shut down, and we are given a chance to focus on something of greater significance than the headlines or the vacuous babble of television. Perhaps for some, this Christmas, the touch will take. I would suggest to you, we're about to go to, can you let Bella out and then we'll come to your picture maybe?
Sure.
Because Bella is trying to tell us something. I would suggest for this Christmas is fall in love with the story again. This is the story that's easy for us to share with our kids, and it should be easy for us to share with ourselves and our neighbors. It's a wondrous story that millions of people want to watch under the mask of Star Wars, or other stories, or the Narnia Chronicles, or other stories where they see it retold in a different fashion. And finally, just before we go to Payton, I want to suggest this. It was the linchpin in an argument that J.R.R. Tolkien made to C.S. Lewis when they were talking about the other bookend of the life of Christ, and that was the resurrection. And he said, Lewis, probably called him Clive, he said, why is it that when you hear the story of a God dying for his people in myth, you love it, it resonates with you? It's magical. When you hear of Balder the Great is dead, it brings a tear to your eye. Why is it that when it's Christ, the true myth, does it make you angry? Well, there's a reason for that. There was an obstacle that happened in C.S. Lewis's life. Bad theology crept in when his mother died, when he was told by his vicar that if he prayed hard enough, his God would heal his mother. And something became an obstacle in the way of the beauty of that story of God becoming vulnerable to lead the birds into the safety of the barn. And it was that linchpin argument. Why is it that when you see this story told in other venues, that it breaks your heart and you cry and you respond to it, but your heart is cold and hardened when it's the Christ story, the true myth, the myth that really is true? And that worked on C.S. Lewis's heart. Notice that the opening to Lewis's belief wasn't through his mind necessarily, but through his heart, because that's where the obstacle lay. So, having said that, that's all I got for you. I hope you had a Merry Christmas. I hope it's wonderful, even in the time of coronavirus. I know that the stores sold out of all their Christmas supplies, and it wasn't expected, which shows that there's a real yearning for the story, even if it in its most commercial fashion, even if it has SpongeBob on the front yard announcing Christmas next to the Christmas crash, which is what we saw in our neighbor's yard. So it comes in different ways. I accept it all. I sanctify Rudolph and Santa Claus, because Saint Nick at the bottom of that story is a story of grace. But it's Payton time. So what do we got here today? Payton, why don't you share both?
Today, I got this for my dad for Christmas. It's the penguin from Wallace and Gromit.
But you didn't get it for me. You made it for me.
Yeah, I made it for him.
And it's my favorite penguin.
And it has a diamond in its arm.
The penguin from Wallace and Gromit, folks. If you haven't seen that.
And I even made it a glove, because it's always wearing a glove on its head to pretend like it's a chicken.
Yes.
So when he takes it off, he's a penguin and he's not wanted for crimes.
And I told Payton that my favorite villains of all time, right, were who?
The penguin.
No, the Joker.
The Joker.
The Joker, Darth Vader.
Darth Vader.
And the Wallace and Gromit penguin, not the Batman penguin, the Wallace and Gromit penguin. So there you have it.
And
Thanks,
I'm pretty
pal.
sure the Riddler.
Oh, I love the Riddler. Yeah, Riddler's up there. All right, what do we got here?
First, I made a castle. Up here, there's a Rapunzel lady. Down here is a bedroom. To the side is a secret door. Nobody knows where it leads to. Here's a bathroom. Down here's another bathroom. Here's another bedroom, entranceway, a dining room, and a really weird pink car, because I'm because I ran out of space, so I couldn't make a good car.
That's fascinating. I'd like to look at the psychology behind this.
And then.
But I
Baby
love to
Yoda.
see. Wait. I love to see a castle with 2 bathrooms. That's very practical. Okay. And we have Baby Yoda. What's in his mouth?
A frog, because
Oh,
in the
that's
show he's
right.
always eating frogs.
Yeah, Baby Yoda eating a frog. What's more touching than that?
I tried to write my name here, but I messed it up,
All
so
right.
I wrote it up here.
Well, I'm glad you recovered because I was worried about you when I saw the Rapunzel and I was talking about Baby Yoda. I was like, she's not listening again. Here we go again.
I listen
Really?
part of the time.
Thanks, folks. Merry Christmas. Have a wonderful, blessed New Year. We'll see you next time. It worked, Bo.